Rain poured relentlessly over the city of Ohio, the roar of trucks on the highway blending with the cutting chill of the wind. Beneath the damp bridge, I saw a figure curled up, his soaked shirt clinging to a frail body. In his arms was a tiny little girl, her face flushed with fever, her breath weak and wheezing. The sight alone was enough to pierce anyone's heart. But for me, the pain was doubled, because that man was my own grandson. The one I thought I had lost forever, 30 years ago. 30 years, since the day my husband collapsed from the shock of betrayal. 30 years of living alone in a cold mansion, branded as the Ice Widow. I had believed that pain was the worst fate life could hand me, that nothing could ever shatter my heart again. Yet tonight, under this bridge, I saw Arthur's eyes, my late husband's eyes, flicker in the face of a homeless man. And I knew everything was about to change from this very moment. There are decisions in life that cut like an invisible blade, slicing through trust, family, and everything we once thought would last forever. For me, that blade bore a name: Damien, the only son Arthur and I ever had. 30 years ago, everything collapsed in a single afternoon. Arthur, my husband, sat frozen before the wide-open safe. Inside was nothing. Accounts emptied, bonds gone, the retirement savings for our old age, and the education fund for grandchildren not yet born, all vanished. I still remember his trembling hand clutching the pocket watch left by his grandfather, only to see even that heirloom ripped away. And the one who took it all was Damien. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just sat there, hollow-eyed, until his hand suddenly clenched over his chest. I rushed to him in panic, but all I heard were ragged breaths and a single name escaping his lips. Damien! His heart stopped right there, in that very room. The doctor said, cardiac arrest. But I knew my husband died of a broken heart. From that moment, I became a widow and a mother without a son. Damien vanished without explanation. Acquaintances turned away. Friends kept their distance. I poured everything into Seabrook Communities, preserving the legacy Arthur had built. People called me the Ice Queen, the woman who lived in Marigold Point Estate without a heart. They never knew that ice was the only thing that kept me alive. Now and then, news of Damien leaked out. He was living comfortably in Seattle, working in an investment firm, married, then a father. At the time, I hired a private investigator, Mr. Owen. The file he gave me was thin. Damien was using Arthur's name and connections to climb higher. I wanted to know about the child, but after Arthur's funeral, I let it go. What meaning was left? Then, 3 weeks ago, I woke in the middle of the night. No warning, no reason, just instinct. I sat by the stove, brewing tea, as though waiting for something. By morning, I called Owen's son, the one who had taken over the agency, and told him to track Damien. 3 days later, a black folder appeared on my desk. I let it sit there for 3 more days, unopened, staring out from my gleaming penthouse window at the endless sea. Finally, I opened it. Inside was the truth about Julian, the grandson I had never met. Born in Seattle, once with a small family of his own, a steady job at a manufacturing plant. Then it all collapsed. Layoffs, a wife who left with another man, the bank repossessing his apartment, his car towed away. Desperate, Julian called his parents, begging for a place to stay. Their reply came in just 2 words: declined. I read that line again and again. My heart froze because I knew that cruelty too well. Damien had once turned his back on his parents. Now he repeated the same betrayal with his own son. History truly repeating itself, a vicious curse. The last page in the file was a blurred, distant photograph. Julian, thin and hunched, sat beneath a bridge, clutching a little girl tightly in his arms. Her tiny hand reached out from a torn coat sleeve to touch her father's cheek. Just that fleeting image. And I saw Arthur's reflection in it. the pure love that Damien had discarded. I set the photo down, and for the first time in years, I trembled. I knew exactly what I had to do. I pressed the intercom for Margaret, my longtime assistant. "Prepare the jet. Call Hector. I'm leaving for Ohio in the morning." "Will anyone be accompanying you, ma'am?" "No, this is personal. I must face it myself." Through the glass wall, I looked down at the city sprawled 65 floors below. People moved like tiny dots, easy to forget. But somewhere under a cold, forgotten bridge, my grandson, Arthur's blood, was still alive. And I, Vivian, would not let history repeat itself ever again. The Ohio sky was as dark as a soaked blanket draped over the entire city. The rain didn't fall. It tore the heavens apart, lashing the earth with thousands of icy whips. A black Lincoln crawled through muddy, pothole-ridden streets, the wipers scraping in steady swishes, swish, swish, yet the windshield still blurred under the downpour. I sat in the back, hands clasped tightly on my knees. The unease made my palms cold, despite the warm hum of the car's heater. Hector, the driver, glanced at me several times in the rearview mirror before clearing his throat. "Ma'am, this area isn't safe. People say all kinds of things. Drugs, violence, muggings. Let me go in first. Check it out?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "No, Hector. This is something I must do. Keep the engine running. I'll go, and I'll return." He nodded slightly. No protest. That's why I had trusted Hector all these years. Loyal, and he knew when to stay silent. The car stopped at the edge of a soggy roadside. I opened the door. At once, a wall of rain slammed into me, chilling straight to the bone. Wind shrieked through the overpass, funneling into the darkness, carrying the reek of gasoline mixed with damp earth and rotting trash. I opened my umbrella, but it felt useless. The rain still struck my face, tracing down the deep lines carved into my cheeks. Every step was a struggle. My Italian shoes sank into the mud with heavy, sucking sounds. I felt clumsy, like an intruder lost in a world I had only ever seen through glass. Above me, trucks thundered past, shaking the ground. And then, in that chaos of noise, I heard it, a child's cry. Weak, broken, nearly swallowed by the storm, yet still there. Not the whine of a spoiled child, but a hoarse, weary cry. The sound of a tiny body battling a fever. My heart tightened. I quickened my pace, though icy water had already seeped into the hem of my trousers. Under one pillar of the bridge stood a makeshift tent of faded blue tarp. The fabric sagged, soaked through, flapping violently with every gust of wind, as if about to rip apart. At its entrance lay a pair of battered shoes, so worn they had lost all shape. I drew closer. Inside, a young man sat curled up. His thin shoulders trembled beneath a damp t-shirt, every movement toward the child in his arms both tender and desperate. He lowered his weary face to the child's burning forehead, as if to share what little warmth he had left. I stopped at the tent's entrance. Rain hammered against the umbrella, roaring. "Julian!" I called, my voice trembling but firm. He flinched, snapping his head toward me. Hollow eyes, bloodshot from sleeplessness, stared at me as if I were the most dangerous intruder in the world. One arm clutched the child tight, the other braced on the ground, ready to flee. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, half growled, half shaking. I crouched, bringing my eyes level with his. "I'm Vivian, your grandmother." His brows furrowed, his lips twisting into a bitter laugh. "What nonsense is this?" My father told me. "You've been dead for years." I inhaled deeply, held his gaze. Damien lied, just as he's lied to all of us. The name cracked something in him, just a flicker. He didn't lower his guard, but I saw a fracture in his wall of suspicion. "I don't know who you are," he rasped, "but we have nothing left to lose." "If you're here to pity us, save it. I don't need it." I stepped inside, angling the umbrella to block the rain from striking the child. Cold water splattered my shoulders, soaking the back of my expensive coat, but I didn't care. My eyes locked on the shivering little one in his arms. She's burning with fever. She needs a doctor." Julian let out a harsh, hollow laugh, like glass breaking. "You think I don't know that? I took her to the ER. They said it was just a cold, gave me some Tylenol, and threw us out. 3 days. And she's still the same." I nodded gently, softening my tone. "Come with me. There's a car, there's a doctor. After that, if you want to leave, you can. But at least, give her a chance to survive." His eyes flickered. He looked at the child, then at me, then back again. His calloused hands clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. I saw rain mix with something else sliding down his cheek. "What's her name?" I asked, almost a whisper. "Nova." His voice cracked. I repeated softly, "Nova." The name rolled off my tongue, foreign yet familiar. Arthur would have loved that name. Julian froze, as though a memory not his own had brushed past. He stared hard at me, searching for deceit. "I don't trust you." This must be some trick. I'm not asking for trust. I'm asking for reality. Nova needs a doctor. You need a dry place to breathe. 1 hour. After that, you can walk away. Silence stretched, filled only by the pounding of rain on the tarp, relentless. Nova whimpered, her tiny hand reaching up to brush Julian's chin, and in that moment his wall of doubt split open. He exhaled sharply, trembling as he rose, clutching her tight. "Fine. 1 hour. We'll go with you for 1 hour. After that, if I don't like it, we're gone. 1 hour is all I ask." I nodded, feeling the mud seep into my knees as I stood. We stepped into the storm. Julian bent low over the child, his thin shoulders shuddering. I lifted the umbrella high, shielding them both. Hector spotted us from afar, rushing to open the back door. His eyes flickered with surprise, but he asked nothing. That was why I trusted Hector. Julian slid into the warm cabin. Nova pressed close against him. And in that instant, I saw, just barely, the fragile glimmer of relief on his face. The look of a man who had been drowning for too long, finally brushing the shore. The car door shut, cutting off the roar of the storm, but in my heart, I knew the real tempest had only just begun. The Lincoln slid through the gray curtain of rain. Inside, it was so quiet I could hear every ragged breath Nova took, mingling with the splash of tires cutting through puddles outside. A weak golden light glowed from the ceiling, illuminating Julian's face, drawn, exhausted, but never leaving his daughter. He cradled Nova tightly, his trembling hand patting her back in a familiar rhythm. I sat across from him, careful to keep just enough distance, not too close, not intrusive. I knew that any sudden move could send him retreating back behind his wall of suspicion. Hector glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I caught his eyes, gave a small nod. He understood. The car drove straight toward the Granville Hotel, a place I had used for business trips for years. There, my trusted physician was already waiting. The rain hammered the roof like a relentless soundtrack to this strange journey. A 78-year-old widow, a homeless young man, and a feverish child, crammed together inside a sealed luxury car. Julian clutched the child even tighter as the car turned onto the main road. His voice rasped, broken. We don't have money." "If you're taking us somewhere that'll cost," I cut in, steady, calm. "No one's asking for money. Tonight, only one thing matters. Nova needs medicine, and you need a place to breathe." He fell silent, but his shoulders lowered just slightly, as though one burden had slipped away. The car pulled up under the portico of the Granville Hotel. Uniformed staff rushed out to open the door. When the warm glow of chandeliers spilled into the cabin, Julian froze, his eyes wary. To him, this world was too foreign, too dangerous. "Come," I said gently. He stepped out, clutching Nova, eyes darting as if every shadow were a trap. I walked beside him, silent. At the reception desk, staff bowed, the elevator already waiting. I noticed the curious glances of guests in the lobby, an elderly woman in a soaked coat, a haggard man carrying a child, the three of us stepping into a gleaming elevator. I ignored them. They didn't know the story behind this scene. The suite on the 14th floor opened, lights blooming automatically to reveal a wide, immaculate room, so pristine it felt almost sterile. At that moment, Dr. Winters, my physician of many years, stepped out of the adjoining room with her medical bag. "Lay the child on the bed," she said evenly. Julian stiffened. "No, I'll hold her." I stepped forward, extending my arms. "Let me carry Nova just for a moment. You can sit right beside her. No one will take her away." He stared at me a long time. His dark eyes brimmed with despair, yet somewhere inside, a flicker of fragile hope. Slowly, so slowly, he transferred Nova into my arms, his hands reluctant to let go. She was burning hot, her breath shallow. I laid her gently on the bed, brushing damp strands of hair from her fevered forehead. For a moment, memory struck, my hand on Damien's brow when he was just a boy. The bitter echo made me shudder, but I pushed it aside and focused on now. Dr. Winters moved swiftly, stethoscope pressed against the child's chest. After several minutes, she looked up. "Respiratory infection. Luckily, we're on time. I'll administer the first dose of antibiotics now." Julian clenched his fists, perched on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on every movement. When the needle touched the girl's skin, he turned his head, biting his lip, but his hand never left hers. "Don't worry," Dr. Winters said softly. "She'll be fine. Medicine, nutrition, and rest in a clean environment are all she needs." Julian nodded faintly, but his eyes glistened. He quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the pillow. I saw his shoulders trembling. After the doctor left, silence filled the suite. Nova slept soundly, her breathing steadier. I settled into an armchair, watching. Julian remained by her side, hunched forward holding her small hand. "Eat," I said gently, gesturing to the tray of hot food the hotel staff had delivered. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry." "You're not hungry, but your body is," I replied. "Nova needs a strong father. Without strength, you'll collapse." He hesitated. Then, almost surrendering, he rose, went to the table, lifted the lid. Steam rose from the dishes. He picked up a spoon, tasted cautiously, then ate faster until he was nearly devouring it. I turned my gaze to the window, pretending not to notice, granting him his dignity. When he finished, I finally spoke. "Julian, do you know why your father told you I was dead?" He looked up sharply, suspicion flashing back. I gave a faint smile, shook my head. "You don't have to answer now. Just remember, not everything he said was the truth." His eyes flickered, uncertain. Then he turned back to Nova, as if seeking answers in the rhythm of her calmer breath. I leaned into the chair. In that moment, I realized the first layer of ice around Julian's heart had cracked. Just a tiny fracture, but enough for the light to seep in. 3 days later, the Florida sky was so clear it felt freshly washed. Gentle late-autumn sunlight streamed across rows of palm trees, reflecting off the deep blue waters of Palm Beach Bay. The private jet from Columbus touched down smoothly on the familiar runway, but this time I wasn't returning alone. Nova slept soundly in Julian's arms, her cheeks rosy, her breathing steady after the first doses of medicine. Looking at her now, it was hard to believe that only days ago she was writhing with fever beneath a freezing bridge. Julian sat by the window, his gaze distant. He hadn't uttered a single word of thanks, but I didn't need him to. Sometimes silence carries more weight than words. The familiar black Lincoln was waiting. Hector opened the door, and Julian stepped out, cautious, as if every inch of this ground could betray him. When the car turned down the tree-lined avenue toward Havenwood, I saw him tense. The house appeared after the bend. Aged white walls, tall columns rising proudly, a roof of weathered red tiles. Havenwood, the house Arthur had built with his own hands, and his dream. The place that had witnessed both the heights and the downfall of this family. Julian whispered under his breath, almost only to himself, "This is a castle?" I gave a faint smile. "No, it's just a house. But once it was a home." The car stopped. I stepped out first, wanting to give Julian a moment of space. He still clutched Nova tightly, his eyes darting about like a wild animal dragged from shadows into sudden light. "Go on. No one here is waiting to judge you," I said softly, reassuringly. The front doors opened. The scent of old wood mingled with jasmine from the back garden. The grand hall stretched before us, light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating every detail, the sweeping staircase, the marble floor, and at the center, a portrait of Arthur. Julian froze, his eyes locked with the painted gaze, Arthur's gentle smile, his steady expression. I heard him swallow hard, his arms tightening around his daughter. "That's your grandfather." "Arthur," I answered, my voice lowering. A long silence followed. I didn't interrupt. Sometimes silence is the strongest language of all. I led father and child to a private wing, rooms set apart from the grandeur of the main house. A warm, modest suite in neutral tones, its windows overlooking the orange grove Arthur once tended. Beside it, a nursery already prepared, a crib, a rocking chair, and new stuffed animals still carrying the faint scent of fabric. Julian stood in the middle of the room, bewildered. "You prepared all of this for us?" "No," I shook my head. "For Nova. And for you, if you'll accept it." He said nothing, but his hand gently brushing his daughter's hair was answer enough. That afternoon, once Nova was asleep, I sat in the library with an old photo album spread before me. Pictures of Arthur in his youth, rough hands, standing before the first house Havenwood ever built. I heard quiet footsteps. Julian lingered in the doorway, hesitant. "May I look?" I nodded. He entered and sat across from me. When his fingers brushed over a photo of Arthur laughing broadly, I saw it, that fleeting, invisible thread of connection. "He looks happy," Julian murmured. He was always happiest when building something for others. A house isn't just walls and bricks. It's memory. It's a place to return to. Julian lifted his eyes, and for a moment I caught a raw ache in them. "I've never had a place to call home." My chest tightened. I wanted to reach across the table, but restrained myself. Instead, I slid the album toward him. "It may have been lost, but that doesn't mean it can never be found again." That evening, Maria, the long-serving housekeeper, prepared her traditional chicken soup. Julian sat quietly at the corner of the table, Nova in a high chair trying her first spoonfuls. She giggled, her bright eyes sparkling. Laughter spread across the table, and I realized Havenwood had been starved of this sound for far too long. After dinner, I invited Julian into the garden. Night had settled, soft golden lights glowing over rose bushes. We passed the small fish pond Arthur once cared for. "I remember," I whispered. "Arthur used to say, 'A family is like a garden. Neglect it, and it wilts. Leave it untended, and weeds take over.'" Julian stopped, gazing into the moonlit water. "My family died a long time ago." "No." I rested a hand on the wooden railing. "Family may be betrayed, divided, broken, but not dead. You and Nova are proof of that. As long as you exist, Havenwood still has a heartbeat." He didn't answer, but in the dim light, I saw his eyes glisten, and I knew the first seed had been planted. On the fourth day at Havenwood, the rain had passed. Florida sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, flooding the living room where Julian and I sat across from each other. Between us lay a thick photo album, its leather spine worn, its pages yellowed with time, yet every photograph still breathed with life. Julian reached out, gently touching the first picture. Arthur, sweat beading on his forehead, his calloused hands gripping a wooden hammer, a small, unfinished house standing behind him. His smile was wide, proud. "He built this himself?" Julian asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Every single brick," I nodded. Arthur never just spoke, he acted. And he believed this: a house isn't only a place to live, it's a place to truly live. Julian said nothing, his fingers sliding across the pages. His eyes stopped at a photo from the dedication of the first row of houses for veterans. Dozens of young families holding children, smiling brightly in front of their modest homes. Arthur stood among them, his eyes shining like a beacon. "He built to give," Julian whispered. "Yes, Havenwood was never meant to simply sell houses. Arthur wanted to build communities, and I tried to carry that on after he was gone." I closed the album, my gaze lingering on Julian. But for 30 years, I only kept the shell. I didn't have the heart to continue Arthur's dream. And then I paused, looking into his eyes. Then I saw you and Nova. Beneath that bridge, clinging to each other, still trying to create a home out of scraps and torn fabric. That was when I knew. Some legacies never die. Julian looked up, his eyes conflicted. A spark flickered, then vanished. He shook his head. "You don't understand," he said bitterly. "A home? My family shattered long before I was grown. My father left nothing but lies." My chest tightened. That name, Damien, was a shadow always lurking at my back. "Why?" I asked softly. "Why do you think he did that?" Julian gave a hollow laugh, his shoulders rigid. "I don't know. Maybe because he was greedy. Maybe because no one ever mattered to him but himself. He told me, you and Arthur abandoned us, that we were nothing but a stain on the Sterling family, and I believed him. For 28 years. Each word struck like a blade. I drew a slow breath, forcing calm into my voice. Damien stole money, he stole trust, but he could never steal the truth. You were never a stain. You are the flesh and blood of Havenwood. Julian clenched his fists, nails digging into skin. You say that, but when I begged him for shelter, when I pleaded for a roof over our heads, he slammed the door in my face. Nova was burning with fever, and I had to choose, wait in the rain or watch her die. Do you even know what that feels like? Do you know what it means to be a father? I fell silent. His words struck like a hammer to the chest. No, I had never felt the desperation of protecting a child in poverty. But I had watched Arthur die in my arms, betrayed by our own son. And now, looking at Julian, I understood. The pain had repeated, only in another generation. I don't have a perfect answer, I admitted quietly. But I know this. If Arthur were alive, he would never have left you and Nova under that rain. And neither will I, not out of pity. But because blood cannot abandon blood, Julian sat in silence for a long time. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock filled the air. I saw his eyes soften slightly, but then he turned to me, his voice trembling. Do you know what he taught me? My father said, trust is a trap. Trust someone, and you'll lose everything. And I've seen it proven, again and again. People laugh, despise, exploit. The world waits for me to slip, just to take it all away. I leaned back, letting the old ache rise before I released it with my words. Your father turned his betrayal into your law of survival. But his law isn't the truth. You've been living his life, not your own. Julian blinked, disoriented. The words pierced through the fog that had clouded him for years. but I knew it wouldn't be easy. His scars ran too deep. From the nursery came Nova's cry, breaking the heavy silence. Julian shot up, rushing toward her. I watched his silhouette, the young father bent under impossible weight, yet unyielding. It was an image both heartbreaking and radiant. As his soft lullaby drifted through the hall, his voice trembling but tender, I sat alone in the living room. Tears slipped down my cheeks, mingling with the faintest smile. I knew the battle wasn't over, but at last the seed of hope had taken root. The Monday morning sky over Palm Beach was a soft blue, the breeze so gentle it seemed reluctant to disturb the palms still recovering from last night's rain. I stood on the steps of Marigold Point, watching as a black sedan idled neatly under the shade of a tree. Julian emerged from the front door wearing a plain white shirt and gray trousers, not perfect, but clean and neatly pressed. He had borrowed Maria's iron the night before, thanking her awkwardly with a mumbled word. In his hand was a slim folder, job application, resume, and a hurried photo taken in the brightest corner of the estate. "Are you ready?" I asked. Julian nodded, worry flickering in his eyes. I'm not sure anyone will believe I belong there. At Seabrook, they believe what you do, not what you claim, I replied. Be honest, be specific. Let your work speak. He drew a deep breath, then bent down to hug Nova, sitting in her rocker beside Isabella. Daddy's going to work, Nova. I'll be back tonight. The little girl didn't understand, but her round eyes lit up, chubby hands grasping the air as if to keep him near. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and walked away. Seabrook Tower gleamed in the morning sun like a colossal mirror. Inside, the high-ceilinged lobby buzzed with footsteps and conversation. Janelle, my assistant, was waiting at the reception desk. She introduced him briefly and led him up to the 13th floor. At the interview room door, she handed him a bottle of water. Take a sip. Paula doesn't like long-winded answers. Be truthful. Be concise. Her smile was kind. The door opened. Paula sat upright, hair in a tight bun, her fountain pen lined perfectly with the edge of her notebook. She had that quiet authority that made people straighten their backs as soon as they entered. Julian? She glanced at the file. Come in, sit. He sat, keeping both hands on his thighs, as though reminding himself not to tremble. Paula skipped pleasantries. Her first question was a blade. Why do you want to work at Seabrook? I need a stable job, Julian admitted. But not only that. I once lived in a house that wasn't a home. I want to work in a place where people understand that a home is for living, not just walls and a roof. Paula looked up, her gray eyes holding on him a beat too long. Experience? 5 years in an assembly plant? I don't know sales. I don't know zoning laws. But I know process, discipline, and how to learn. She scribbled quickly. Do you have family? I have a young daughter, Julian answered. I can't do endless overtime, but when I commit, I finish. Paula closed the notebook. You'll start as a field assistant. It isn't glamorous. Early mornings, sun, hauling signs, logging materials, taking minutes, updating site diaries. Every small mistake could cost us dearly. Can you handle that? I can. His voice steadied. Paula gave the faintest nod, as if that was the only acceptable answer. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Seabrook Shores site. Wear practical clothes, closed-toe shoes. Bring a notebook. The interview ended so abruptly Julian nearly forgot to breathe. When he stepped outside, Janelle winked. Congratulations. With Paula, go to site means you're hired. The first day on site began with the smell of wet concrete and the blare of truck horns. The sun had barely cleared the tree line, yet already burned hot on his neck. Julian stood before the posted regulations, reading every line, then quietly fastened his hard hat. The foreman handed him a stack of A3 drawings. Here's Block B3 to B7, Road D1, temporary drainage. Note every issue. Don't fix. Just record simple in theory. In reality, a maze. Julian followed the site engineer, eyes darting between paper and ground, ticking boxes, marking uneven grading and cracked curbs. Sweat trickled down his temple, streaking dust into gray lines. By noon, his notebook pages were blotched with damp ink. Paula arrived at 2, unannounced. She scanned his notes, eyes moving like scanners. Good. Include time, location, photos. She tapped one line. Here, you wrote, possibly dangerous. What exactly? Temporary shoring at the pit edge is loose. Heavy rain could cause collapse, Julian answered. Paula signaled for work to stop, ordered reinforcement and signage. Then she turned to him. My name is Julian, he said quickly, almost embarrassed. Julian, she corrected. On site, could must be will, unless you have the fix. Good. Continue. For others, her praise might be nothing. But for a man still finding his footing, it was everything. For the first time, Julian felt less invisible. That evening, Nova waited at the door with Isabella, swaying to children's songs from the kitchen. When she saw him, she babbled nonsense syllables, arms outstretched. He removed his helmet, washed his hands thoroughly, then scooped her up. The smell of sweat, sun, and dust mixed with milk and baby powder into something deeply human. He closed his eyes briefly, storing it away. Dinner was simple: pumpkin soup, grilled fish, steamed vegetables. Julian ate slowly, with the caution of someone afraid of eating too fast after too many hungry days. Around the table we spoke of small things: Nova's nap, the noisy morning birds, Janelle's email about staff orientation. No one mentioned Damien. That wound was still waiting. The first week passed in repetition. 5:30 a.m., coffee, a kiss for Nova, instructions for Isabella. 7 o'clock, clock in at the gate, receive tasks. 12 o'clock, lunch in the shade of a container. 4:30, complete logbooks. Send to project office. 6:30, home in time to bathe Nova. At night, after she slept, he sat at the kitchen table with the old laptop I'd lent him, watching tutorials, reading blueprints, safety regulations, even free lectures on real estate basics. One evening, I found him wearing headphones, eyes fixed on the screen. A speaker explained, "Designing for people. Why sidewalks must be 60 centimeters wider to fit a stroller and a pedestrian. Why shade trees should be planted 5 meters from bus stops." Julian scribbled carefully, each line angled, precise. "Why are you watching this?" I asked, already knowing. "Because I once thought a good house was 4 strong walls and a roof that didn't leak," he said, taking off the headphones. "But when I pushed Nova's stroller under that bridge, I realized the most important part of a home is the path between the front door and the world outside. If that path isn't safe, isn't kind, then a house is just shelter, not living." I smiled. Arthur would have loved that. Julian looked down, flustered by the compliment. "I'm only just beginning." On the 9th morning, clouds gathered early. The site was warned of sudden showers. Paula called for full prep: cover materials, check drains, shore weak foundations. Julian was sent to inspect the temporary drainage at Block D1. The rain came at 10, as if someone flipped a switch. Water gushed in milky torrents along the roadside. Julian stood soaked, notebook in hand, eyes scanning for a choke point. He spotted it, a burst cement sack blown into the culvert mouth, damming water into a swelling pool where a truck was about to pass. He whistled, but the rain swallowed his voice. No time. He splashed down, dragging the heavy sack free. Water rushed through, sweeping debris aside. The truck rumbled past, tires skidding slightly but holding. From a distance, Paula raised her hand, thumbs up. No words. By noon, the storm cleared. Julian sat trembling in the container, adrenaline fading. Paula set a hot tea before him. "Good. But next time, stop the truck first. Your body isn't the solution. Write that in the logbook. With a prevention measure, I understand," he said, breathing deep. And in his eyes, there was light. A man who had just passed a test, life had sprung without warning. Rainy days left Nova sniffling. Dr. Howard visited, listened to her lungs, prescribed mild sprays and fluids. Julian held her close, noting every instruction. Later, he rocked her in the nursery, singing softly. I watched from the doorway, not intruding. The way he held her, careful as if cradling the whole world, made the small room glow. That night, he knocked on my study door. "Thank you for the doctor," he said awkwardly. "I only tied a thread," I replied. "You held on." He nodded, turned to leave, then hesitated. Today, at the site, in the storm, I thought of the bridge. Nova would have been soaked, sick again. I was afraid. "You feared the right thing," I said, "and you did the right thing." By the weekend, Janelle hosted a soft skills orientation for new staff, email etiquette, note-taking during resident meetings, how to say no with kindness. Julian listened closely, asking questions. Janelle set an exercise. Describe a good home in 3 sentences without using the words beautiful or big. Julian wrote, "A good home is where you can carry a child through the door without tripping, where morning begins with the sound of boiling water, not leaks, where evenings allow open windows without fear of rain." Janelle read, smiled. Perfect. Sunday night, Nova went to sleep early. Outside, the sea was calm, palms whispering. Julian brought me a small box, the old phone I had given him on his first day. He placed it back on my desk. "Keep it," I said. "No." He shook his head. "You gave me a place to breathe. A job to stand on my own. This should go to someone who needs it more. I'll buy my own when I get paid." When I studied him. Small acts can weigh like vows. "As you wish," I said, though warmth spread quietly in my chest. As he turned away, I called out, "Julian." He paused. "From tomorrow, you don't need to ask permission to take Nova into the garden. This is home," I said. "For both of you." His eyes changed, like a light turned on in a long, dark room. "Yes," he answered, just one word, but it carried the weight of a journey. That night, I stood on the balcony, watching Julian carry Nova around the courtyard before bed. The full moon draped silver light over the tiles, the gravel path, the young father's shoulders. I thought of Arthur, of the first houses he built, of how he said, "Place the brick right, and you place a life on the right path." New days had begun. No fireworks, no fanfare. Just steady steps, steady hands, and hugs tight enough for a child to know she was safe. And sometimes that alone was the miracle. 3 weeks after starting at Seabrook, hurricane season swept into Florida. In early October, black clouds blanketed the sky, and sea winds heavy with salt barreled across the half-finished site. Seabrook Shores was racing to complete infrastructure, internal roads, storm drains, and the foundations for the model homes. Julian had adapted to the strict rhythm. Up at 5, on site before 7, observe, log, report. Paula shadowed closely, letting nothing slip. Yet it was this very rigor that sharpened Julian's focus, making him meticulous to the smallest detail. He was no longer the panicked man under a rain-soaked bridge. He was rebuilding a life, by hand and by grit. That day the sky hung heavy and gray, the air swollen with storm. The crew pushed to finish a temporary retaining edge before the forecast downpour that night. At 11 a.m., a shout burst from Lot D2, where a 3-meter pit had just been dug. "The soil's sliding!" Water's rising fast. Julian sprinted over. A worker was trapped in the pit, rainwater from a secondary channel pouring in, dragging mud with it. One side of the temporary shoring had snapped. The wall was starting to shear. Minutes more and both man and pit would collapse. The crowd surged. Some moved to jump down, but the danger was too great. Paula arrived, eyes sweeping the scene. "No one into the pit! Tie a safety line! Get a ladder!" Julian didn't wait for the kit. He bolted to the container, grabbed a coil of rope and a high-vis vest, looped the rope around his waist. "Hold me steady!" he barked, voice louder than the drumming rain. "Are you crazy?" an engineer yelled. But Julian was already sliding down the lip, catching a bare timber, skidding through muck toward the trapped man. The worker thrashed, one leg wedged beneath a slab of slumped soil. Julian shouted over the storm, "Don't thrash! Take my hand!" He drove a small shovel into the mud and cut around the man's leg, hard, fast strokes. Mud caved, water rose. Up top, 3 workers braced the rope, bodies taut as cables. With a final pry, the man's foot came free. "Pull!" Julian roared. The line snapped tight. Both men were hauled inch by inch over the rim. The moment they cleared the edge, a slab of earth caved in, water roaring down and swallowing the pit whole. The sight froze for a beat. Then cheers broke, clapping, whoops. The rescued worker collapsed, gasping, eyes red with shock and relief. Julian slumped into the mud, shaking, clothes caked, breathing like he'd summited a mountain. Paula stepped in, face cool but voice low. "Reckless, but you saved a life. Next time, follow safety protocol. Today, good." It was her first clear public praise. Julian only nodded, eyes still on the worker, as if to make sure the man was truly safe. By afternoon, the rain eased. Once the incident report was written, Paula called a quick field room meeting. She summarized. Julian's site notes were the most detailed. "Without his early observations, we might have lost the pit and the schedule. From now on, I want him handling site safety, still at assistant level, but reporting directly to me." Julian blinked. "I'm just the new guy." "Correct," Paula said. "But your eyes don't miss things. And you put people before tasks. That's what I need." The room quieted. Then a few heads nodded. Julian flushed, unused to recognition. But I knew. That was the first brick laid in the new foundation of his life. That evening, when he returned to Havenwood, Nova toddled toward him on unsteady little legs. He dropped to a knee, swept her up, arms tight as if to banish the morning's ghosts. I stood at the end of the hall and watched in silence, my own heart light and full of pride. After dinner, I asked Julian to the garden. Post-storm air carried damp earth and jasmine. Moonlight skated across the small pond. I poured tea and slid a cup to him. "I hear you saved a man today." Julian scratched his neck, sheepish. "I just reacted." "No," I shook my head. "Instinct can make you run." You ran in. That wasn't just instinct. That was a choice. He said nothing, eyes on the curling steam. I went on. "Arthur used to say, a home isn't built only of timber and stone, but of safety. People call a place home when they know, returning here, they won't be abandoned. You did that for a stranger. Do you think you could do it for many more?" Julian looked up. For the first time, his eyes held more than doubt and shadow. There was a small flame, the awareness that he could make a difference. "I will try," he said, steadier than usual. I smiled softly. That's all Arthur and I ever hoped for. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I opened Arthur's old journal. The page was yellowed, his careful hand still strong. "Someday someone will keep building, not just with bricks, but with a heart. If I'm gone, let it come to my own blood." I set down my pen and added, "Arthur, I found him under a bridge in the rain." Today he stood and pulled a man back to life. Your spark never went out. I closed the book, feeling lighter. Outside, the ocean murmured. Inside Havenwood, a new cycle had begun, with Julian, with Nova, and with me. Late October mornings in Florida have a distinct light, no longer harsh but sharp enough to etch every vein in the leaves. At Seabrook Shores, the site buzzed like a hive. Familiar sounds filled the air, compressors pounding, hammers clanging, engineers calling out, punctuated by the sudden laughter of seasoned workers swapping stories about a roof just completed. Julian stepped out of the operations container, hard hat snug, a fresh safety log tucked under his arm. Paula pointed toward a newly poured internal road. "Check the barricades, put up pedestrian warnings. And don't forget a temporary stroller path at Section B." He nodded. No questions needed. Ever since the rescue incident, Paula had handed him additional duties, safety oversight and temporary accessibility for future residents. It sounded small, but it demanded seeing the world from 90 centimeters high, or from the slow steps of the elderly. Julian began by crouching down. He studied curb edges, slopes, loose gravel that could jam stroller wheels. He told the crew to sweep a 30-meter stretch clean, lay down anti-slip mats, and mark a thin painted line as a gentle path, a place where a mother could hold a child's hand with one arm and push a stroller with the other without stumbling. A worker joked, "You're too thorough." Who's even going to notice? Julian just smiled. Someone will. Anyone walking with a child will. He didn't have to add, he once pushed Nova's stroller over heaps of trash under a bridge. By lunchtime, Paula called Julian into the makeshift meeting room. On the table sat a scale model of the sample homes, internal roads, rows of trees, the central park, the community hall. Beside it lay a stack of feedback forms from prospective residents who had toured earlier. Paula tapped her pen. "Read." Julian skimmed, then stopped at one page, a child's doodle of a playground swing drawn too close to a blazing sun. Beneath it, a mother's words. "On weekends it's unbearable. No shade at the children's corner, the benches are scorching." He thought for a moment. Plant a cluster of trees in the southwest corner, or install a light canopy and, he glanced at the model, move the benches by the water fountain 3 meters inward. That way they'll catch shade instead of direct glare. Paula raised a brow. "Cost?" "Trees are minimal. The canopy we can price later. But moving benches? Cheaper to fix now than after handover." Paula marked the plan in red. "Do it." She paused, then added, "And arrange a session with the prospective families so you can hear directly." Julian blinked. "Me? Meet them?" "Yes," Paula said flatly. "You saved a man's life." "Fine. But the real work is preventing danger in the design itself. Learn to listen and turn feedback into change." Julian nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't say it aloud, but his heart raced, not from fear, but from the strange weight of being trusted. That evening, Havenwood glowed softly. Nova had become a little breeze, toddling through hallways clutching her floppy-eared rabbit. She had new words: Daddy, Grandma, water, and one Isabella swore no one taught her: no, every time someone tried to take her favorite spoon. At dinner, Nova sat in her high chair, banging the spoon for more mashed pumpkin. Julian pretended stern. "Slow down, princess." She pouted, thrusting the spoon out like a command. I laughed, a sound I thought I'd forgotten. Afterward, Julian carried Nova to the garden. The sky hung low, moonlight sifting through the canopy. They walked along the gravel path to the pond where koi shimmered beneath the water. Nova pointed, squealing, "Fish!" the word stretching into a joyful note. Julian bent and whispered, "One day, you'll tell Daddy which paths are easy, which are hard, and I'll fix them." I stood on the steps, holding hot tea, watching. A simple image, but whole. This was home. The prospective residence fair came on Saturday. White tents rose by the model homes, information desks set, master plans displayed. Young families arrived with strollers and flyers in hand. Paula observed from afar, letting Julian take point. A teacher couple paused at the model. Julian greeted them, voice a little tentative but sincere. "Hello." "I'm Julian, responsible for safety and mobility. Do you two walk often?" They were surprised. Rarely did anyone ask that before talking about square footage or kitchen islands. The wife smiled. "We love walking, and my mother will visit often." Julian nodded. "Then I wouldn't recommend that corner unit. The slope's tricky for elders." but these 3, near the park, have wider sidewalks. He circled them, explaining each. By day's end, the feedback list was short but sharp. More shade, crosswalks at junctions, child height benches, clearer signage at the community entrance. Not a single granite countertop, just small things, but the kind that make a life. Paula passed by, murmuring, "You're selling homes, not stone." "Well done," Julian smiled, a rare smile, one that came naturally this time. While Julian grew on sight, Nova bloomed in her own way. She adored the reading room. Each afternoon she tottered in clutching picture books twice her size, plopping them onto the armchair by the window. She couldn't read, but she'd stroke the pages, point at window, tree, and always the little house with the red roof, every time, exclaiming, "Home." One night, Nova woke from a nightmare, crying hard. Julian was up instantly, scooping her close. She sniffled, clutching his shirt. He sat on the floor, back to the wall, rocking her gently, humming a tune I knew well, the same melody Arthur once sang. I stood outside the door, hand on my chest, heartbeat syncing with the lullaby. Legacy. Sometimes it was nothing more than a song passed down. As for me, in those calm days, I prepared for a storm only I could smell. Naomi, my legal advisor, spread documents across my desk, restraining order drafts, records of the 30-year-old transfers and withdrawals, copies of Owen's old investigations. She spoke slowly, weaving a net. "We can't reopen the old case. The statute's gone. But we can build a fence around Julian and Nova. Protective order, updated security at Seabrook and Havenwood, internal alerts at reception, and a discreet media plan if we need to shield the project's image from rumors." I nodded. "Do it all," quietly, but strong as steel. Naomi asked, "Will you tell Julian?" I hesitated. "Not yet. I want Nova to have a little more peace. And Julian, he's still learning to trust. When the time comes, I will." Naomi understood. She packed up and left. I stayed, staring through the window at the palms glittering with evening light. In the glass, I saw my face, old, but for the first time in years, not numb. I whispered, "Arthur, I won't let anyone touch what remains of us." The first signal came on a Wednesday afternoon. Janelle handed me a business card with no logo, just a number and a name, Sabrina. On the back, in handwritten ink, "We need to talk." "About your son." I turned it over, fingertips cold. Sabrina, Damien's wife. The woman who once walked at his side, chin high, as if the world owed them apology. The second signal came at Havenwood's gate. Hector reported a gray sedan circling 2 days in a row, parking, then leaving, rental plates. Naomi traced it, registered to a service company. Not illegal, but the scent of surveillance was clear. The third came at Seabrook Tower. The front desk said a middle-aged man asked for Julian's schedule, calling himself Family. When asked for ID, he left quickly. I told Hector to double patrol, updated the Do Not Admit list at the tower, with Damien at the top. That weekend, I took Nova to the farmer's market. She loved stroking the round oranges, inhaling the bread's warm crust, grinning at vendors with broad, calloused hands. We returned with a basket full: citrus, white lilies, a roll of wafers. Nova hugged the wafers like treasure, her cheeks sticky sweet. As we entered the great hall, I saw Julian standing still before Arthur's portrait. Afternoon light fell on his face, gilding his cheek. He turned and smiled. "Grandma, I just got an email. Paula's put me on the team planning the community amenities. It's a small group, but I've been invited." I set the basket down, warmth spreading through me. "Congratulations." He scratched his head, shy. "I don't think I'm ready. But I want to try. I want to build something Nova can grow up in, and other children too." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're readier than you think. And when you feel yourself waver, remember, don't build with fear. build with love. At our feet, Nova looked up, raising her wafer. "Daddy! Grandma, eat!" We all laughed. Some would say it was only a small moment, but sometimes it's the smallest pieces that weave the strongest bonds. That night, I opened a wooden box from my desk. Inside lay Arthur's pocket watch, the one thing Damien hadn't taken, because it was in Arthur's coat when he fell, and I had held it tight. I wound it, tick-tick, steady as a faraway heartbeat. The doorbell rang, polite, but enough to straighten my spine. Hector's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ma'am, there are two at the gate. They call themselves Sabrina and Damien. They want to see Julian." I closed my eyes for a second. No surprise. Just a moment I always knew would come, and now it had. I set the watch down and rose. In the hall, Nova babbled to her rabbit. In the study, Julian scribbled notes for the amenities, more shade, more fountains, lower benches, and I walked toward Havenwood's great door, where night wind slipped through the cracks, carrying jasmine and the chill of confrontation. "I'll go down," I told the intercom, "and this time we talk as people who know exactly who we are." My hand rested on the door handle. Outside, the past was waiting. Inside, new roots had already taken hold, and I knew which side I would stand on, not with hatred, but with the firm boundary of a true home. The iron gate of Havenwood opened a narrow slit, just enough for the streetlights outside to pour a thin ribbon of brightness across the gravel. Hector stood ramrod straight, earpiece in place, two security guards holding formation behind him. On the other side, Damien and Sabrina loomed. Their silhouettes stretched long on the pavement like two black ink stains. I stepped down the stone stairs. The night wind carried jasmine and a hint of sea salt. At the far end of the hall, I heard Nova's babbling. In the library, the rustle of Julian's pages paused, then went still. I signaled for Hector to open the gate a little wider, enough for words to pass, not bodies. "We're here to see our son," Damien began, his voice rasped raw, as if sanded down. "Family business." "No need to involve you. Family?" I repeated, each syllable weighted. "You call this family after 30 years?" Sabrina lifted her chin, that old haughty poise unbroken. "We read the papers. Seabrook's about to unveil the model homes. The leading man in the recent features is Julian, our son. Please, Alice." "Vivian," I corrected, calm. "My name is Vivian." She blinked, as if she'd swallowed something bitter. Damien cut in, impatient. "Enough. We want to see him. As parents, we have rights." "Rights?" I tilted my head. The gate lamp cast a thin gold on my face, enough for them to see. I wasn't angry. I had chosen cold. "Rights belong to those who shoulder responsibility. Where did you leave yours? Under a bridge, on the day you slammed the door in your son's face." Damien narrowed his eyes. "He lied to you." "He's ungrateful. We couldn't—" "I was the one who found your son," I said, not raising my voice, each word hard as steel. "Do you know where he was? Do you know how Nova, my granddaughter, shivered with fever inside a soaked coat? Do you know what the hospital said? Did you hear her wheeze with every rainstorm? Were you there, or were you busy keeping your rights somewhere else?" Sabrina slid in, syrup sweet and razor sharp. "You're spinning a sob story." "We had our hardships too. Bad investments, bankruptcy. Every child has to learn independence. He's grown. He chose the bridge. Now he's famous, successful. We want to correct old misunderstandings. That's all, misunderstandings." I exhaled, almost a laugh without humor. "I have a thick file on those misunderstandings. Transfers, statements, the authorizations you reminded your father to sign the morning he died of a heart attack. I left it be for 30 years. Arthur was gone, and I refused to turn my life into a courtroom. But tonight, you stand at my gate to demand rights." I nodded to Hector. He handed me a dark blue envelope. I drew out a paper, my voice even. This is a court-ordered restraining order. For both of you. You are barred from approaching Julian and Nova within 200 meters and from contacting them directly or indirectly. Copies have been sent to your counsel." Damien stiffened. Sabrina needed half a beat to toss her chin. "You can't stop us from seeing our son. The law allows an adult to choose who counts as family," I cut in, "and Julian has chosen. If you want to invoke blood, remember this. Blood without meaning is just an empty noun." A gust stirred the palms to whisper. I watched Damien's hand knot into a fist, veins rising like taut wire. "What do you want?" he hissed. "Money? You always had money. That's why you think you can buy everything." "I once lost everything to money," I answered, meeting his eyes. "And you were the one counting the last numbers in that empty safe. I don't need to buy a thing. I'm keeping what remains of Arthur Hector shifted, ready to close the gate." I lifted a hand. Not yet. I wanted them to hear it all. "I'll say this once." I fixed my gaze on Damien. "The day you shut your door on Julian and Nova, you pulled the pin on your so-called rights as a father. You signed the renunciation with your own actions. And now that he stands on his own, you come for his signature?" "No." Sabrina changed tactics, the edge softening. "Vivian, listen to me. We're not asking for money. Truly not. We only want a chance. To meet, to explain. The child, Nova, she's still our granddaughter." "Yes," I nodded. "She is my granddaughter. Arthur's too. And my duty, if you want that word, is to protect her." Sabrina pressed her lips together. She turned to Damien for rescue, but he only looked at me, anger gone, bringing out the old habit of bargaining. "Give me 10 minutes. I'll speak to him alone. No you, no guards. I just want—" "No." I shook my head. All my life I rarely used words like commands, but tonight each syllable dropped like a nail into the gravel. "If you have something to say to Julian, say it through counsel. Put your explanations in the light, under your legal signature. Don't go hunting for a soft spot at my gate." Damien's jaw worked. A twitch pulled at both cheeks. For a flicker I saw it, not remorse, defeat. The old pressure tactics had lost their power here. "I see," he said quietly. "You want to replace me." "To be mother again, to my own son, no," I said, so softly it was almost a breath. "I want to be a grandmother. And I want Julian to be a father." The courtyard held its breath. Sabrina squeezed her handbag strap until her knuckles bleached, then let go. She squared her shoulders, smoothed already immaculate hair. At last she drew a long breath. "Let's go." Damien lingered a second. He looked past me into the dim hall. There stood Julian, one hand on the doorframe, eyes steady, silent. We hadn't planned it, but I knew he had chosen. Sabrina tugged his arm. "Let's go," she snapped again, voice snapping back to ice. "They want a war. They'll have a war." I stepped half forward. "No one wants war." "We're drawing boundaries, and as of tonight, those boundaries are set in law." Hector slid the gate shut. The metal rolled into its track with a long scrape, like the sound of the past closing. The gray sedan started, turned, and disappeared beyond the palms. I stood still, letting the breeze dry the cold sweat at my collar. When the engine noise was gone, I turned back. Julian hadn't moved, neither forward nor back. The hall light fell across his face, uneasy and relieved. "You didn't have to do that," he said, low. "I did," I answered, "because last time I wasn't in time. This time I am a crease at his eye eased." He drew a deeper breath, as if pulling in the oxygen long missing from his life. "Thank you," he said. 2 short words, heavy enough to shake my chest. From inside, Nova suddenly called out, bright and loud, "Grandma! Daddy!" A summons. Julian smiled, his eyes lighting in that way only a child can summon from an adult. He tilted his head, gesturing for me to go first. "Come on! She's hungry. She doesn't understand restraining orders. She understands milk, and milk has a schedule." I laughed, a sound I thought I had misplaced somewhere between board meetings and reports. Together we walked toward the warm light of the kitchen. On the way, I ducked into my study and dialed Naomi. "They came," I said simply. "Activate the security package and notify Seabrook's general manager. Bar Damien and Sabrina from all facilities unless there's a legal summons." "Understood," Naomi replied. "Are you all right?" I looked out at the courtyard, the palm shadows marching across the walls like sentries. "All right, and lighter." When I reached the kitchen, Nova was already in her high chair, palms patting the tray, eyes expectant. Julian swirled the bottle, tested it on his wrist with the care of a physician. I pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Tonight," I said, perhaps to myself, "we celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Julian asked, placing the bottle in Nova's hands. "Celebrate a door that just closed," I said, "and a home that still stands." Nova latched onto the bottle, eyelids drooping, sleep tugging. Julian looked at her, then at me. No more words were needed. We both understood. The bigger battle wasn't keeping people out, it was keeping peace in. That night, when the house had settled into silence, I returned to my desk. Arthur's pocket watch ticked on. Steady, steady. I opened my journal and wrote beneath yesterday's line, "Arthur, today I held the gate." I closed the book and blew out the small candle. Darkness folded gently around me. Somewhere in the house, Nova turned over with a tiny sigh. In the room next door, Julian's even breathing was a quiet lullaby, and I, for the first time in years, slept deep without dreams. Monday morning, Florida sunlight poured through Seabrook Tower's blue-tinted glass, throwing diamond-shaped patches across the stone floor. Paula entered the small conference room with a stack of files and motioned for Julian to take the chair beside her. On the screen up front, Seabrook Shores, Phase 2, Community Amenities and Residential Connectivity. "You'll present the resident experience section," Paula said crisply. 15 minutes, no flashy decks, numbers, site photos, and 3 proposals we can execute immediately. Julian drew a breath. He'd sat through dozens of on-site meetings, but this was his first time presenting to the mid-management group: engineering, legal, finance, and Victor, the board partner known for his flinty standards. The door opened. People settled. Paula kicked off and went straight to substance. When she cued him, Julian stood, plugged in his USB. The first slide appeared, a low-angle shot of a walkway with a stroller following the gentle path, tree shade striping the raw concrete. "It cost us $600 to shift the bench line 3 meters, Julian began, voice steady. "In return, this past weekend, a grandmother could sit in the shade and watch her grandchild on the swing without the slant sun in her face. Small cost, big impact. That's the operating principle for this section." A few nods. Julian advanced the slide. A child's drawing of a hot playground beside a photo of newly planted broad canopy trees in the southwest corner. Proposal 1. Add wide canopy trees plus a light shade sail at the children's play area. Materials: galvanized steel frame, 95% UV block fabric. Cost: $18,000 all in. Install time: 6 days, no interference with main civil works. Benefit: surface temps down 6 to 8 degrees Celsius at peak hours. Kids won't burn their hands on the slide rails. Next slide, a diagram of crosswalks at the park model home junctions. Proposal 2, crosswalk markings plus tactile rumble strips at 2 high-flow intersections. Cost: $3,200. Benefit: 41% reduction in near-miss incidents per last weekend's manual counts. Data from the safety team. Victor leaned forward, tapping the table. "Where does 41% come from?" Julian didn't rush. He pulled up a backup slide, a simple spreadsheet photo from his phone, columns for time, crossings, near miss, ped vehicle. Over 2 weekend days, we counted 116 crossings. 14 instances required hard stops. With a spotter deployed, that dropped to 8. Postmarking and rumble, we estimate 6 to 7. That's 41 to 46%. Victor leaned back, silent. Proposal 3. Add dual-height drinking fountains plus low benches near the community hall. In our future residents cohort, 57% have children under 6. 1 fountain low for kids, 1 standard for adults. Cost, $9,500. I recommend tying into the current plumbing scope to avoid re-excavation. Paula interjected. Cost source? Julian brought up the final slide, a summary table. We saved $42,000 by switching hardscape pavers from imported to local equivalents in low-impact zones. The surplus covers these 3 items, leaving $11,300 contingency. The room held for a beat. Victor folded his arms. Financially fine. But are you turning a mid-market project into a kindergarten? We sell to adults, not children. Julian met his eyes. Adults buy with reason, but they stay for daily life. And daily life revolves around kids and elders. A finance manager chuckled under his breath. The air loosened. Paula closed. Implement all 3. Julian to oversee and report weekly. As people drifted out, Paula pulled Julian aside. Good. Your answer to Victor. Clean. Next time bring 2 budget paths, with and without contingency, so he can't bait you on overrun. Julian nodded and wrote in his notebook, 2 scenarios. That afternoon, Julian headed to the community hall site to brief the crew. He unrolled drawings, pointing to fountain and bench locations. This 1 8 centimeters lower, for kids. This 1 standard height. A foreman frowned. Why the hassle? Most places just install 1. Julian didn't argue. He asked Isabella to bring Nova by, right after her nap. Still drowsy, clutching her floppy rabbit, Nova was set gently on the mock bench. Her short legs dangled, straining. See, Julian said. Lower by 8 centimeters, and she can climb up herself. No lifting. The foreman watched and nodded. Got it. 1 lower run for the little ones. I'll bevel the edge too. Avoid scraped knees. Thanks, Julian said. Technique is born of seeing. That evening, Vivian sat at the table listening to Julian's recap. She didn't gush. She asked, Did you let Victor drag you into a cost fight? No, Julian smiled. I dragged him into everyday benefits. Vivian inclined her head. Keep doing that. After dinner, Nova toddled to the reading room with a picture book. She opened to the red roof house and announced, Home! Julian lifted her onto his knee. What does your home have? Nova thought, then said, Water? Pointing at the tiny fountain by the playground. Julian laughed. Yes, water, and a low bench for you. Vivian watched them, warmth rising like a sip of tea. Arthur's beliefs were being translated into the language of the present, through livable details. A week later, Seabrook hosted a town hall for the surrounding neighborhood, the people who would live beside Seabrook Shores. These sessions ran hot, fears of traffic, noise, kids underfoot, and the familiar drumbeat of, Why build here? Paula stood beside Julian in the lobby. You take soft mobility and amenities. Listen before you answer, she said. Let them feel you understand why they're upset. The hall filled every seat. A middle-aged man stood first. I drive this corridor every morning. 50 more homes means how many more cars? Did you even calculate? Julian nodded. We did. Peak hour increase averages 16 to 22 cars per 10 minutes at Branch D. We're adding speed humps and crosswalks, synchronized with the Waverly Light. I'll send you our counts and simulations. The man snorted. You people only talk in numbers. True, Julian said, but tonight I brought people. He bent, lifting Nova. Isabella had brought her at the end. The child rubbed her eyes, wary of the crowd. "This is Nova. If she runs across the road, I want humps and crosswalks to remind drivers there's a child there." The room softened. The man looked at the little girl and gave a tiny nod. A grandmother in row 3 raised her hand. "Those low benches, do any have backrests? I get sore if I sit long." Julian smiled. "Yes, and we'll add one with armrests so it's easier to stand." Questions followed: trash, night lighting, off-leash dogs. Julian answered patiently, made no empty promises, and wrote down items needing new surveys. When it ended, some stayed to shake his hand. No one praised a pretty plan. They said, "You listened." For a project meant to live decades, listening is often the most valuable permit. Outside, Paula walked with him. "They'll still complain. But tonight you shifted the board from opposition to co-creation. From here on, you're the face of Seabrook Shores." "I thought you were the face," Julian joked. "No." Paula shook her head. "You own the experience. Do your part well. Don't worry about mine." Inside the company, Victor hadn't let go. At the weekly board review, he fired a cold volley. "If materials spike 8%, where do you cut? If residents complain about night noise, who's accountable? If month 1 sales miss by 20%, what's your weapon?" Julian didn't dodge. He set down 2 scenarios, just as Paula had coached. Scenario A, preserve experience standards. Optimize local paver supply chain, lock a 6-month framework contract to reduce volatility risk. Scenario B, trim ornament, don't touch core amenities. Remove decorative brick wall at the park corner. Use shrub massing for edge definition. Saves $26,000, no impact to lived experience. Core amenities, Julian said distinctly, are untouchable. Victor studied him. "You're stubborn." "Yes," Julian replied, "on the things that touch daily life." Across the table, Vivian stayed quiet, no prompts, no rescue. She observed how Julian held a line without losing civility. When the meeting ended, Victor didn't praise him, but he didn't press further. In Victor's language, that was provisional acceptance, enough to keep the project moving. Late one night, Julian parked by Havenwood's curb and didn't go in at once. His passenger seat was a drift of papers, traffic sims, materials lists, resident feedback. He leaned back and exhaled. These days came like tides, surging in and receding, leaving behind numbers and faces tangled together. The front door opened. Vivian stepped out with a light shawl. "A cool night," she said. "Yes," Julian gave a thin smile. "But my head's still in a storm." "Storms are good," Vivian replied. "They drive roots deeper. If a tree only knows sun, the first seasonal wind will fell it." Julian was quiet. Then, "I'm afraid I'll become him." Rigid, overbearing. "Damien imposed because he feared losing power," Vivian said evenly. "You're protecting standards because you want to protect people. Different. And if you ever lose your way, let someone pull you back. Call Paula, call me, or simply take a walk and push Nova's stroller." He laughed, this time genuine. "I understand." "Come in," Vivian said. "She's waiting to tell you her fish story." At month's end, Paula sent an email. Proposal: appoint Julian as acting lead. Resident experience, Seabrook Shores, 6 months. Vivian didn't reply immediately. She forwarded it to Victor for comment. 1 hour later, he answered, "Tentative approval. Next quarter trial. Sales plus satisfaction indices. If not met, reevaluate." Vivian smiled and typed 3 words to Paula. "Let's begin." That evening, the family celebrated with vanilla ice cream and strawberries on the porch. Nova squealed for an extra candy. Julian didn't say much, but his eyes were bright. He understood, not just a title, but a vote of confidence. With a clock, with metrics, with pressure, like real life. Before bed, he stood on the second-floor balcony. The breeze was cool, jasmine rising. Below, the trees swayed. Somewhere inside, I, Vivian, stood in the reading room, opening Arthur's journal. I wrote one small, clear line. Today, he began to lead. Not because I appointed him, but because he took someone's hand and walked them across the path between a front door and the world. Night moved slowly. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. Material prices could jump. Neighbors might complain. An uninvited call from the past might return. But tonight, Seabrook shifted tempo. When a man once abandoned under a bridge started learning to guide other families home. And that was the first handover, not of titles, but of responsibility. Monday morning, Havenwood Tower wore a pale winter sun. 65 stories of glass reflected Florida's washed blue sky, so clear it felt as if you could peer straight into the conference room on the 45th floor, where the entire board had gathered. I sat at the head of the table, quietly studying each face. Men and women in dark suits, hands resting on thick dossiers. They'd grown used to hearing me speak for 30 years. But today, my voice would not be the center. Paula sat to my left, cool and concise as ever. Opposite her was Victor, steel-gray eyes sweeping the room. Midway down the table, not at the head, not at the end, sat Julian, white shirt, navy tie, hair neatly combed. He opened his folder, but I could still see his hands tremble slightly. A pen tapped on the walnut tabletop. Victor spoke first. We're here to evaluate Seabrook Shores. Phase 2 is 92% on schedule. Costs are 1.7% over plan. But the resident experience line under your purview, Julian, ran $31,000 over its cap. I want to know why silence pressed in. I didn't answer. Paula didn't either. Every eye turned to Julian. He took a breath and stood. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, we overspent by $31,000. But that figure must be read alongside outcomes. Please look here. He clicked the remote. The screen filled with a weekend photo of Seabrook's Central Park, children slipping down a slide beneath a shade sail, a few elders seated on benches with armrests, a mother pushing a stroller safely across a bright crosswalk. Nothing glamorous, just warm and alive. We sold 46 homes in 3 weeks, 18 above forecast. The top reasons, per buyer surveys: child safety, cooler play areas, a friendly community. The 3 items we overspent on are exactly the 3 they mentioned. Next slide, a revenue comparison table. Overage, $31,000. Incremental revenue, $6.8 million. Return on investment, over 200 to 1. A low ripple moved through the room. Some board members bent toward each other, nodding. Victor raised a brow, but didn't cut in. Julian went on. Numbers aren't everything. Hear a story. He played a short clip. A young family stood before a model home. A toddler toddled into the yard, laughing. The mother said, "We chose Seabrook because I can let my child play outside without worrying about cars." This is where we want to call home. Children's laughter filled the sealed room. I glanced around. Faces that had been stiff since the hour began softened. Not because of the spreadsheet, because that sound melted ice. Julian stopped the video and stood square. Seabrook isn't just a real estate project. It's proof Havenwood still holds to Arthur Hargrave's core. We don't build houses. We build places people feel safe calling home. If you believe I'm unfit, I'll resign as team lead. But the philosophy, I will keep to the end. He sat. The room swallowed the words. Victor leaned in, fingers drumming lightly. Fine sentiments. But if a crisis hits, can you lead? A project isn't just laughing children, it's debt, building codes, and impatient investors. Then what? Julian lifted his head, eyes steady. I don't have every answer, but I know how to listen, and not to placate, to act. Last week's storm proved it. I went into a footing pit and pulled a man from a slide collapse. I didn't do it for a paycheck. I did it because that was a life. Projects are the same, the lives of hundreds of families. I won't abandon them. A beat. Then Paula, quiet but firm. I confirm. I was there. All eyes slid to me. My turn. I laid a hand on the table but didn't stand. For 30 years I've searched for a successor. There are many who can read numbers, run operations, sign papers. Far fewer can look at a site plan and see the people inside it. I see Arthur in Julian. More importantly, I see Julian Victor nodded slowly, the steel in his gaze not quite so cold. Your proposal? I drew a breath. Appoint Julian as Associate Director, Community Development, overseeing all Havenwood residential projects. 18-month probation, reporting directly to the board. This decision is not about blood, it's about results. A murmur rippled. The chair, Marlene, hair silver, voice steady, tapped the gavel. Vote. Hands rose. 1, 2, 5, 9 of 12. Enough. Motion carries, Marlene announced. Julian sat very still, his features loosening as if a weight slid off his shoulders. He turned toward me, wordless, eyes bright. I allowed myself, at last, to smile, in full view of the board. That evening, I stepped into my office and found him sitting alone, Nova asleep on the sofa beside him. The desk lamp cast a soft pool of light across his face, tired and shining. You did it, I said. Not alone, he answered, brushing Nova's hair. But today I saw it, Grandma. They believed. Not because you said so, but because... I stood on my own. I laid a hand on his shoulder. Yes, and that is the true meaning of a handover. Outside, Florida's city lights blinked on. Somewhere beyond, the ocean murmured. Arthur's story, and mine, had moved into the hands of a new generation, carried by a heart once abandoned under a bridge, now standing in a boardroom and persuading an entire council. Late afternoon. The last sunlight poured gold across Havenwood's garden. Palm trees cast long shadows, and birds cut the sky in gentle arcs toward their nests. The air carried the sweet jasmine fragrance, mingled with a faint salt from the distant sea. Inside, laughter rang bright. Nova toddled down the hallway, waving a crayon drawing of a red-roofed house with a green door. "Here's our house!" she squealed, curls bouncing. At the long table, Julian looked up from a set of blueprints, a tender smile spreading. Beautiful, Nova. Looks just like Daddy's Seabrook. I stood further back, watching in silence. That sight, so small, so ordinary, was the dream I had carried for 30 years. A child's laughter filling Havenwood again. No more hollow wind through empty rooms, no more deafening silence since Arthur's passing. That evening, we dined on the veranda. Honey-roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, avocado salad, simple but warm. Nova chattered through her bites about preschool, her half-formed words sending Julian and me into fits of laughter. Midway through, Julian set down his fork and turned to me. "Grandma, I think it's time." "Time for what?" I asked. "Time we stopped being temporary." "I want us to stay here, Nova and me, not as guests, not as visitors, but as family, as home." I froze, my chest thudding, joy and fear tangled together. "Are you sure?" "Havenwood carries shadows." Julian nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. But if I keep letting the past define me, I'll become him, Damien. I don't want that. I want Nova to grow up in a place filled with love, not lies. And Havenwood itself, it deserves to be full of laughter again." I studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then Havenwood is ours." 3 generations under one roof, Nova didn't understand it all, but she clapped and sang out, "Our house, Grandma's house, Daddy's house, my house." Her giggles spilled into the garden, dissolving into the falling night. The days that followed shifted into a new rhythm. Nova rode her little bike around the courtyard. Julian worked on his laptop by the veranda, and I replanted Arthur's old rose bushes. Each afternoon we strolled the grounds together, Nova's humming louder than the crickets. One day I opened an old desk drawer. Inside, Arthur's pocket watch still ticked, slow but steady. I placed it into Julian's hand. "This should have been passed on long ago," I said. "Arthur believed a home isn't built only with bricks and stone but with responsibility. Now you carry it." Julian said nothing. His eyes shimmered. He gripped the watch tightly and nodded, resolute. Spring came. Seabrook Shores officially opened. Hundreds of families gathered. Children darted through the park, adults snapped photos. On a small stage, Julian spoke for the project team. His words weren't polished or grandiose. "These houses aren't perfect," he said, "but we built them so people can find perfection in the everyday. A child's laughter, shade for grandparents, and safety when the door closes at night." Applause rose and swelled. I stood in the crowd, pride rising in me like a tide. In Julian, I saw Arthur, not as a copy, but as a continuation. That night, back at Havenwood, Nova ran to the small garden pond. "Grandma, fish!" she cried, and indeed, tiny fish glided beneath the moonlit water. I smiled, recalling Arthur's old words. "A home needs life to echo." Julian came beside me, eyes on Nova. "Grandma, I think it's time we expand Seabrook again. This time, focusing on affordable housing for veterans. I proposed it to the board. They agreed to a pilot. My heart skipped. Exactly as Arthur had once dreamed, Havenwood building homes for those who sacrificed. "Do it," I whispered. "I believe in you." That night, after Nova was asleep, I penned the last entry in a journal I had kept for 3 decades. "Arthur, the circle has closed. Damien may have vanished or returned with hollow demands. But the true legacy isn't in the bank accounts he stole. It lives in a grandson once abandoned under a bridge, now leading a community. It lives in Nova's laughter, in this house filled with light. And it lives in me, no longer just a shadow, but walking beside them. Arthur, we are home." I closed the journal and blew out the candle. Outside, the sea breeze carried jasmine into the night. Inside, Nova murmured in her sleep, whispering, "Daddy? Grandma?" I smiled softly. After 30 years, I was no longer the keeper of shadows. I was part of a home. And that home would endure, with Julian, with Nova, and with every family Havenwood welcomed. If you believe that a home is not built only from bricks and stone, but from love and responsibility, please leave a like on this video. If you believe that even a child once abandoned under a bridge can grow to become a guiding light, then share this story so more people can be inspired. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales so you never miss the journeys where justice, truth, and compassion always find their place. See you in the next story, where every tear and every smile carries a lesson worth remembering.